Cedar Grove Elementary was a small school nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a place where the biggest scandal usually involved the lunch menu or playground politics. That changed one cold November morning when the intercom crackled to life during the second period math class. Attention, all teachers and students. This is not a drill. Initiate lockdown procedures immediately. Mrs. Henderson, the math teacher, paled as she rushed to lock the door. The students, a mix of confusion and fear on their faces, huddled in the corner, away from the windows. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the occasional nervous whisper or the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Minutes turned into hours. The initial fear began to morph into a strange, uneasy calm. Some students dozed off, while others stared blankly at the walls. Mrs. Henderson did her best to keep everyone quiet and calm, but even she could not hide the growing tension. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud, echoing bang from the hallway. It was followed by heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. The students' eyes widened in terror as the sound grew nearer. Mrs. Henderson motioned for silence, her finger to her lips, but her own eyes were filled with panic. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. The handle jiggled, and the door rattled in its frame. Whoever was out there wanted in. The sound of heavy breathing could be heard through the door, and then, a low, guttural whisper, "I know you're in there." The students clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces, but not a sound escaped their lips. The door rattled again, more violently this time. It felt like an eternity before the footsteps finally moved away, fading into the distance. Hours later, when the lockdown was finally lifted, the school was swarming with police. The students and teachers were escorted out of the building, past the terrified faces of parents waiting outside. It was later revealed that an escaped convict had been spotted near the school, prompting the lockdown. They never found out who or what had been outside their classroom that day, but the memory of those heavy footsteps and that chilling whisper haunted them all for years to come. St. Mary's High School had its share of ghost stories, but none were more terrifying than the tale of Lucy Harper. Lucy was a bright, cheerful student who disappeared one rainy afternoon during a school lockdown. It was a normal school day when the principal's voice came over the intercom, announcing the lockdown. The students were accustomed to drills, but something in the principal's tone suggested this was real. The teachers quickly locked the doors and herded the students to safe corners. In Mrs. Carter's English class, Lucy sat next to her best friend, Emily. They whispered to each other, trying to stay calm. The rain pounded against the windows, and the dim light made the classroom feel claustrophobic. Minutes into the lockdown, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the students' quiet whispers turned into panicked murmurs. Mrs. Carter tried to reassure them, but her voice was shaky. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the ceiling, followed by a scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the roof. The sound grew louder and more frantic, stopping directly above their classroom. Then, without warning, the ceiling tile near Lucy and Emily fell, and a pair of cold, pale hands reached down, grabbing Lucy and pulling her up into the darkness. Emily screamed, and the classroom erupted into chaos. Mrs. Carter frantically called for help on the intercom, but there was no response. The other students stared in horror at the gaping hole in the ceiling, too terrified to move. When the lights finally came back on, Lucy was gone. The lockdown ended, and the police searched the school from top to bottom but found no trace of her. The official report stated that Lucy had run away, but Emily and the rest of her classmates knew better. They had seen those ghostly hands and heard Lucy's terrified screams. Years later, St. Mary's was closed down and left abandoned. Rumors spread that on rainy days, if you listened closely, you could still hear Lucy's cries echoing through the empty halls. Lincoln Middle School prided itself on being a safe and welcoming environment for students. That was why the lockdown during fourth period history class was so unsettling. Mr. Thompson, the regular teacher, was out sick that day, and a substitute named Ms. White had taken his place. She was a peculiar woman, with an old-fashioned dress and a demeanor that made the students uneasy. Still, the day had been uneventful until the lockdown was announced. The students were restless, whispering and fidgeting in their seats. Miss White stood at the front of the class, her back ramrod straight and her eyes fixed on the door. There was something unsettling about her calmness. Minutes later, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. The students tensed up, their eyes darting towards the locked door. Miss White remained still, watching the door with an unnerving intensity. The footsteps stopped outside the classroom. The handle turned slowly, but the door was locked. Suddenly, a low, malevolent voice called out, "Miss White, it's time to come home." The students looked at each other in confusion and fear. Miss White's expression changed to one of sorrow and resignation. She turned to the class, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry, children," she whispered. "I thought I could escape, but it seems my past has finally caught up with me." Before anyone could react, the door burst open, and a cold wind swept through the room. Miss White was lifted off her feet, as if by an invisible force, and dragged towards the door. The students screamed, but they were frozen in place, unable to move. Miss White's last words echoed through the classroom. "Remember, always be careful who you let into your life." With that, she was gone, and the door slammed shut behind her. The lockdown ended shortly after, but the students were left with more questions than answers. The police found no sign of Miss White or the intruder, and there were no records of her ever being employed by the school.